Hello, Chapel High School students. My name is Joe, and this is week 4 of What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do. Before we start this week's message, let me pray. God, thank you so much for us to be able to continue to learn from your word through social media, God, through technology, and I look forward to the time when we can be together again in person. And Lord, until then, I pray that you continue to open our hearts and help us to learn what to do when we don't know what to do as we study the life of Joseph. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, we all have favorite movies, right? I don't know what yours is, but one of the things that we love about movies is the characters, and one of the most important things to the characters and to the whole development of the movie is the backstories, right? And backstories will help you to understand why the character is in the situation that he or she is in. Now, there are some times in movies when there will be a flashback or part of a backstory that at the time you just don't understand. You're like, why is this even in here? This doesn't make any sense. I don't know what that means. And chances are, you've probably felt that way in your own life before. There are moments in our real life stories that make us ask the same questions, okay? You're thinking, okay, what is happening to me? And what's the point of me going through this? And it's usually something bad, right? And so today we're talking about pain, and we're talking about struggle, and we're talking about problems. The things that will be part of our backstory one day. Now, but as for now, they can be in our current story. We've all had difficulties, right? Especially this year, 2020. I mean, who could have guessed that this year would have unfolded the way that it has? We've all had pain, struggles, and problems this year. And we're in the middle of them, and let's be honest, it's rough, right? But for the past few weeks, we've been talking about this question. What do you do when you don't know what to do? And today we're going to talk about what to do when people make fun of you, when a friend of yours passes away, when your learning disability makes things so difficult, your parents' divorce is just killing you inside, your self-harm habit gets out of control, someone you love gets really sick, all of the losses that you've had to face this year because of COVID. And in other words, this is the heavy stuff, the painful stuff, the real life stuff. And before we can even ask the question, what do I do? We often ask ourselves the question, why, right? Why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? Why is this happening in my life now? And just like a movie that flashes back to a scene that doesn't seem to make any sense at the moment, difficulties can make us feel the exact same way. Difficulties often feel random, pointless, or unnecessary, and sometimes we see the point after the fact, when it's part of our backstory. For example, you may have a broken friendship, but looking back, you realize that the friendship that you were in led you to make some really bad decisions, and you may have not liked that version of yourself very much. So even though it felt bad at the time, you're glad now that happened. Sometimes we see the point in the moment when the difficulties are happening. For example, maybe you find yourself struggling in band and, it was on you. You just weren't putting in the effort. You got called out by your teacher or by your section leader and you started doing extra rehearsals, extra work, and you got better. It wasn't fun, but it was for the best. It's nice when that happens, but let's be real. Most of the time, things that don't feel good oftentimes seem pointless, right? We've all had experiences and hurts, and it feels pointless in the moment. Whether it's not making a team, whether it's not being a part in the musical, or going through drama with friends or family or illness or a million different things, we've all asked ourselves, why me? And when we go through these things, there's usually not many good answers in the moment. And what's worse, the outcome sometimes doesn't turn out the way we want it to. And in those times, it can be really difficult for us to see any point behind our pain and to find hope despite the hurt and then have the determination just to keep going forward despite these difficulties. But when life is confusing or it's difficult, we can actually learn what to do by looking at people who have handled similar situations, which brings us back to the life of Joseph. Now, we've been looking for a few weeks at the events in Joseph's life, and here's a bit of a recap, all right? Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Now, if you have brothers, I don't know what they're like, and they may drive you crazy, but this has probably never happened to you from your brothers. So he was taken to a foreign country. He was taken to Egypt, where he was forced to work for a high-powered official. And then he is falsely accused of doing something he didn't do, and he gets thrown into prison. So from a free man to a slave to a prisoner. If anybody had earned the right to ask, what's the point? Why is all of this happening to me? It was Joseph. And that's where we pick up. Joseph is in jail for a crime that he didn't commit, and here he makes some new friends. Check it out. It says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was. Now, you might be wondering what the cupbearer is. And that was the person who would sometimes actually when the king or the Pharaoh had something to drink, he was the one that would bring it to him. And he had to taste what was in the cup first, just to make sure that it wasn't spoiled, that it wasn't bad, or that it wasn't poisoned. Okay, this was a very, very important person, as well as the chief baker. These were both direct reports under Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. So Pharaoh is the boss of all Egypt, and if he got mad at you and he wanted you thrown into prison, well, that's where you go, even if you hadn't done anything illegal. And that's what happened to these two guys. They were thrown into prison with Joseph. The story continues. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So there's a lot happening here, all right? Now remember, Joseph is in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and even in this really difficult situation, Joseph continues to honor God. So these guys tell Joseph their dreams, and with God's help, Joseph actually interprets their dreams and tells them what they mean. And then what Joseph said was going to happen actually happened. Based upon the dream of the chief cupbearer, Joseph said that he was going to be restored to a favorable position under Pharaoh, that he was going to get out of prison and that he was going to be restored into his former position. And that's what happened. As for the chief baker, Joseph said that he wouldn't have that same luck. And well, as you find out later on, he didn't. And you would have thought that given what Joseph had done for the cupbearer, it would have made sense for the cupbearer to maybe speak up for Joseph and maybe to put in a good word for him and also tell Pharaoh about how he had this ability to interpret dreams. But that's not what happens. The story tells us that the cupbearer actually forgot about Joseph. He got out of jail, he gets restored to his position, and he just goes on with his life. And over time, Joseph is sitting in jail waiting for this friend to remember him, and he realized that especially what he did, he helped out his friend, but what he didn't help Joseph's situation at all. And I'm sure he was tempted to wonder, Well, what was the point of all of this, God? It didn't help my life get any better at all. Have you forgotten about me, God? I thought I did what was right. I tried to honor you, and now I'm still here in jail. But then 2 years later, Pharaoh has a couple dreams that really trouble him. And he desperately searched for somebody within his staff who could interpret them, but no one could. And that's when Lightbulb, the cupbearer, remembers the guy he had been in prison with. He remembers Joseph. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, who interpreted the dreams with incredible accuracy. And as a result, Joseph was eventually made second in command of all of Egypt. It was a full 2 years, though, before the cupbearer even remembered Joseph. But when we see the big picture and the context of this backstory, we see that Joseph's challenging circumstances uniquely positioned him to do something great. But Joseph still had to wait 2 years. All the good things that happened in Joseph's life didn't make those bad things okay. Being promoted to second in command, didn't undo that time he had spent in prison. It didn't undo the slavery. It didn't undo his brothers rejecting him and selling him. But at the same time, those difficult circumstances positioned Joseph and prepared him to do something great, something only he could do, something only that God would only do through him. And the same is true for you and for me. Hard things can and will happen in your life. And it's important to remember that just because something happens doesn't mean that it was something that God did or wanted for you. Because of sin, things in this life are not fair. This world is broken. And a lot of times, the things that happen just don't make sense. People hurt each other, and they create systems that hurt each other. But when it seems like it's impossible that anything good can come out of a situation, I want you to remember that God is really good at doing the impossible. One of my favorite verses is Romans 8:28, and it says this, and we know that God works all things for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purposes. It may not seem to make things better, and it may not even make sense yet, but God is in the business of taking hurt and taking difficulties and taking pain and redeeming them and using them for your good. That means even if what was done to you was evil or was meant for evil, God can not only use it for good, but he can use it not only for our good, but for the good of others as well too. So in other words, when you don't know what to do, remember that your problems can position you for a purpose. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be fixed or go back to how it was before everything happened. It just means that God can tell a new story in our difficult circumstances. It means that we can have confidence in God's ability to redeem things, to know that good can and does come from bad. I've experienced this in my own life. It means that the bad things in our life don't get the last words. The hardest and the worst things that we experience aren't the end of us or the end of our story. In fact, they could be the beginning, a part of something more. So when we go through pain and we can't see the purpose yet, here are some things that can help us to get a bigger perspective. The first one is to remember that no one else has your life story. Your circumstances may not be fun, but they are unique to you. They put you in a position to learn and to grow and to discover things that no one else can. God is using your tough stuff in ways that you can't imagine because they've shaped you in ways that no one else has ever been shaped. And that may not make it easier, but it may give you a perspective or a way to see things differently. And then the second one is to remember that your story can interact with others. Although no one else has your life story, many people do face similar circumstances, and you could be a voice to help them through their own challenges and pain. A help that you would not have been able to provide had you not gone through similar situations. So, when you have family drama, you can help people who are also going through family drama. When you go through a hard breakup, you can understand how someone else feels when they experience that same thing. When you deal with a sickness or an illness or injury, you can encourage people who are walking through that same thing. When you've had big doubts and big questions in your faith and you've found answers to those, you can be a safe place to talk about those for people who are questioning their own faith. The truth is, the next best thing to having something fixed for us is to having someone who has been through it too walk alongside in our mess with us. And so Joseph went through pain that at the time felt pointless. But when we see his backstory, we understand that God used his problems and he positioned Joseph for a purpose. God took this impossibly bad situation and used it to create unimaginable good down the road. And so as we close this week, I want you to remember this. What if God is using your painful situation to position you for something amazing that you haven't even imagined yet? And what if the first step is simply asking for his help?